Hello guys, my name is Shmail. I will be going through the multi-store model. So let's begin. So Atkinson and Schifrin proposed the multi-store model, which is a linear model containing unitary stores which are short-term memory and long-term memory. Now, for those who haven't seen this model may seem complicated at first, which when I first started psychology, I thought, whoa, this is a bit complicated. But as soon as you get to know what short term memory is and long term memory is, it's pretty simple. So if you haven't seen my previous videos on short term memory and long term memory, I would go and see that first and then come back to this, and it will just make life a little bit more easier. So, you have the sensory register, the short term memory, and the long term memory. And so what happens is you have the stimulus, so the environmental input, which is which comes through in the form of either sight, sound, taste, smell, touch, and so that gets stored in the sensory register. And if attention is not paid to it, so if you don't pay attention to that certain thing in the environment, then that thing will be forgotten and just totally gone out of sight. Sorry, gone out of your memory. And so if attention is paid to it, then it will move on to short term memory. Now, for example, right now I am talking to you, and you've probably heard a little click sound, but since you didn't really pay attention to it, that click sound was forgotten. But now I've mentioned the click sound, so you've probably remembered it. And so now if I click again like that, you would have paid attention to it, and so it moves on to your short-term memory. And now that's just one example. And so what happens from there is the sensory input is saved in the sensory register, and attention is paid to it and goes in short-term memory. Then what happens is this thing called rehearsal. So to prevent short-term memory from decaying or being forgotten, you must rehearse your things. So your whatever you've paid attention to, you must rehearse it in order to for it to stay in short-term memory for a long period of time. So for example, you are in a car and you drive past a restaurant with a phone number outside that restaurant, and you look at the phone number and you start to rehearse it. So you go 07482807482807482, and you keep on rehearsing this, and this is called rehearsal. So the repetitive saying of that word is called rehearsal, and so you're maintaining it. But if you don't do that, it will be forgotten through decay or displacement. So what I mean by displacement is if I'm saying 472847284728, and someone else comes along and says, oh, it's just some random numbers, then that will displace what I have recalled in my head. Rehearsed in my head. And sometimes it's forgotten through decay if you don't rehearse it enough. But then if you go through rehearsal for a long time, then it leads to storage in the long-term memory, and so that stays in your long-term memory. Now, what happens is sometimes stuff in your long-term memory is forgotten through interference or retrieval failure. So sometimes you have things that might interfere, and sometimes you might have problems trying to remember exactly what the numbers were, for example. But then, if you've recalled it enough, rehearsed it enough, then you are able to retrieve that memory from your long-term memory. So you're able to retrieve that certain thing from your long-term memory, and you do this again by retrieval, and so that information goes from your long-term memory back to your short-term memory, and then you can say it, and so forth. So let's have a look at the sensory register in more detail. So the sense organs have a limited ability to store information for about less than a second. So the ability to store information is around about a second, probably 50 milliseconds. And so the senses involved are echoic, auditory, gustatory, haptic, and olfactory. Now, you probably haven't heard so much of these words, so you might use the words sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, but they're pretty basic words. This is A level, and the higher vocabulary you use, the more marks you get. So I've put echoic, auditory, gustatory, haptic, and olfactory. And so these senses become active due to the action in the stimulus or environment. So if attention is paid to it, like I said, to the activity in the environment, then it moves on to short-term memory. If not, then it is forgotten. So, short-term memory. Attention is needed to retain the information acoustically, mainly, or sometimes visually, so long enough to use it. So, for example, looking up at a telephone number and remembering it long enough to dial it. So, short-term memory here is in the middle, so approximately lasts around about 18 to 30 seconds and has the capacity of around about 7 plus minus 2 items. And for the information to move from the short-term memory to the long-term memory, rehearsal is required, otherwise it will just decay or be displaced. Long-term memory, this provides, which is the end part of the multi-store model, long-term memory provides the lasting retention of information. So it increases the time that it's in your brain, and so from minutes to a lifetime. So it gives you more time for you to keep hold of that such information. So long-term memory appears to have an almost limitless capacity. So it's unlimited to retain information, but it could never be measured as it would take a long time. So if it was to be measured, you would probably have lots of problems, like people would die during the experiment due to the long period it would take to find out the duration of long-term memory. So which is why we say it's unlimited. And so information, long-term memory information seems to be encoded mainly in terms of semantic memory. Now if you went back to my other long-term memory video, separate video, we looked at semantic memory, and basic semantic memory is more about facts and knowledge. And so I've made this table here. So types of memory, so you have sensory registers, short-term memory, long-term memory. So we have, and you have the capacity, duration, and encoding method. So if we look at sensory register, look at its encoding method, it's got an answer of modal specific. So this basically means it's dependent on how the person encodes it, on his ability, his cognitive ability, basically. And short-term memory is that its capacity is 7 plus minus 2 items. Duration is 18 to 30 seconds, and it's mainly encoded acoustically, and so on and so forth. So this is the table I've made here, and yes, that's it for today. And in the next video I will look at the evaluation of the multi-store model, which is crucially important. So yes, so if there is any problems or anything good about this video, please comment it down below, and please do subscribe and like.